Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we won't visit ancient wars or grand castles. We'll wander instead into a sleepy little post office tucked into a quiet 19th century village, where time drifted slowly. Where letters waited patiently, and where nothing much ever happened. Just the way we like it. Let your breath settle, your mind drift, and join us as we wonder quietly, over and over again, why things were just the way they were. Part 1: Why the postmaster always opened the door at exactly 7:03 a.m. Every morning, without fail, the heavy oak door of the village post office creaked open at exactly 7:03 a.m. Not 7 o'clock, not 7:05, but always, precisely, consistently, and without exception, at 7:03. No one quite remembered when it started, nor did anyone ask, but there was a sort of calm reassurance in the way it happened. At 7:02, the front window would remain slightly fogged from the night's cool air. The curtains, a faded beige with tiny hand-stitched stamps on the hem, would still be drawn. The handle would remain still, untouched. The street would be mostly silent, save for the occasional clack of a milk cart wheel or a sleepy cough from the bakery next door. Then, as the clock in the small watch shop across the lane chimed a very polite 3 bells after 7, the latch would lift with a soft metallic click. The door, ancient and slightly swollen from years of damp seasons, would offer just the faintest resistance. But the postmaster, Mr. Edwin T. Fleece, knew exactly how much pressure to apply. He gave it no more and no less than it needed. Inside, the scent of paper, ink, and tea leaves that had never quite left the room would drift out gently, as if greeting the cobblestones. Why 7:03? There was no dramatic story, no decree, no superstition. It was, according to the postmaster himself, simply the right time. 7 o'clock, he felt, was a bit too eager. And 7:05 might appear careless. But 7:03, well, 7:03 gave the impression that he had not rushed, but had not delayed, that he respected time, but didn't worship it, that letters, though important, could wait just a moment longer before beginning their quiet journey. And so it was. For years, through rainy seasons, frost, and one memorable summer when a family of sparrows built a nest in the mailbox. The rhythm never changed. The door opened at 7:03. The morning began, and the sleepy little world of correspondence gently stirred back to life. Nobody in the village ever questioned it. In fact, most people set their own routines around it. The baker started kneading at 6:50. The grocer opened the shutters at 7:10. And the children walking to school knew that if they heard the post office door opening, they had exactly 12 minutes to reach the chapel bell before it rang. Some things in life don't need to be exciting to be meaningful. Some things are just quietly right. Like a door opening at 7:03 a.m. Part 2: Why the inkwell was never quite empty, but never full. On the corner of the postmaster's desk, near a small stack of envelopes that never moved much, sat a modest glass inkwell. It wasn't ornate. It didn't have a silvered top or a carved base. Just a square, slightly smudged container of thick glass, filled with ink that was always, strangely, at the same level. Not brimming, not low, just quietly sufficient. Mr. Edwin T. Fleece never measured it, and he never wrote down how often he refilled it. But if one were to look at it each morning, And again at closing. It seemed as though it hadn't changed at all. The ink itself was a soft black. The kind that dried a little dusty. It didn't smudge easily. And when it did so politely. Not in great blots, but in gentle sweeps, like a sigh across parchment. The inkwell sat between two other unremarkable items. A brass stamp press that squeaked gently when used. And a letter opener shaped like a feather that had never seen anything more urgent than a wedding invitation. Why was the inkwell never empty? Why never full? Perhaps it was because the postmaster didn't rush his writing. He wrote slowly, with soft fingers and deliberate loops. His pen never scratched. It merely glided, and when he dipped the nib, he did so with the kind of care one usually reserves for stirring tea. Some said he refilled it every third Wednesday. Others swore it was after every full moon. But Mr. Fleece simply smiled when asked and replied, "It always has just enough." There was something comforting in that. In a world that often felt too fast, too loud, too full or too empty, the inkwell existed in a perfect in-between. It reminded those who visited the post office, if they happened to notice, that balance didn't have to be exciting. It could be quiet, still, measured, just like a pen gliding across a ledger, with ink that always waited patiently to be used. Part 3: Why the mailbag squeaked softly on cold mornings. Every morning, after the postmaster unlocked the door at exactly 7:03 a.m. and lit the lamp above his desk, even when the sun was already up, he would turn to the corner, bend down slowly, and lift the same leather mailbag from the same worn hook on the wall. The bag was brown, cracked in places, and patched 3 times, once with a square of denim from a retired apron, once with waxed canvas, and once with something no one could quite identify. It had seen every season, every letter, and every gentle tumble into the back of the postcart. But most notably, it had a strap that squeaked. Not loudly, not rudely, just softly, especially on cold mornings. It wasn't a sharp squeak, like a hinge needing oil. It was more like a whisper, a barely there sound of stiff leather shifting in protest against the chill. And for those who had reason to listen carefully, it always came at the same moment, when the postmaster placed the bag on his shoulder. Just after fastening the brass buckle. Why did it squeak only when it was cold? Some believed the strap, being old and particular, stiffened slightly with the early frost. Others said the squeak was not in the leather but in the rhythm of the morning itself. There were theories, of course. A schoolboy once asked if it was a kind of winter bird trapped inside. Mr. Fleece simply smiled and said, "I think it just misses the sun." There was never any urgency in fixing it. No one ever offered to oil the strap. No one suggested replacing it. Because, somehow, the squeak had become part of the village's quiet routine. It signaled the day had begun, truly begun. It followed the opening of the door and the rustling of the first envelope. It happened just before the sound of the milkman's wheels. And long before the clock tower struck 8. For many, the soft squeak was a kind of comfort. A reminder that things were proceeding just as they always had. That the world still turned with its familiar noises and patterns. And in a world full of loud clocks, shouting markets, and clattering horseshoes, the gentle squeak of the mailbag, heard only on cold mornings, felt like a whisper from time itself. Part 4: Why the ledger pages were turned so very slowly. There was a large ledger book on the postmaster's desk. It wasn't beautiful, or new, or particularly important to anyone outside the post office. But inside, it held every note of mail received, every parcel sent, every small fee paid, and every curious occurrence that might someday be worth remembering, or, more often, forgetting. Bound in worn green cloth and smelling faintly of old glue and pressed flowers. The ledger sat open for most of the day. Its spine relaxed into the shape of habit. Mr. Fleece would approach it just after placing the mailbag down and warming his hands on the teapot lid. He'd gently tap the edge of the page twice, once to greet it, and once more, perhaps, just to feel it move. And then, he'd turn the page, slowly, painfully slowly, to some, deliberately slowly, to others. It was not the slowness of confusion or indecision. No, it was the kind of slowness that came from deep respect. Each page made a soft, papery sound, like the brushing of wings. It bent slightly, hesitated in the air, and then nestled gently against the others. As if returning home. Why so slow? Well, some said the ledger contained secrets. Others thought the postmaster simply liked the sound the pages made. One boy believed the pages would tear if rushed, and that the book would cry out in protest. But Mr. Fleece, when asked, would only say, "Pages remember how they're turned." No one really understood what that meant. But no one needed to. There was a kind of peace in the ritual. A stillness that spread through the room as each page was slowly revealed. With lines ready to be filled in with names, dates, and destinations like Miss Penelope Thistle 1 parcel, buttons. Possibly decorative. The ledger never complained, and though most of the entries were so unremarkable they seemed to cancel themselves out. The act of writing them, of noticing them, felt oddly sacred. In the hush of the morning, the turning of the page felt louder than it was. And somehow, that gentle moment of nothing became one of the most important parts of every day. Part 5. Why the first letter of the day was never urgent. Each morning, after the page of the ledger was turned with ceremonial care, the postmaster reached into the mailbag and withdrew the first letter of the day. It was never the largest letter, nor the heaviest, nor the one with the fanciest script or the most exotic stamp. No, somehow, it was always a modest little envelope, cream-colored, slightly creased at the edges, addressed in neat handwriting that leaned ever so slightly to the right. And, always, it was not urgent. It was never marked, urgent, express, or even, please read soon. There were no exclamation marks, no underlining, no second attempt at postage. It never smelled of perfume, nor of ink still drying. It never came with haste and never left with it. Why? Well, some villagers believed the first letter chose itself, and that only the least hurried among the batch made its way to the top of the pile. Others said Mr. Fleece had a sense for what belonged first, an instinct like a librarian for forgotten books. But if you asked the postmaster directly, he would nod thoughtfully and say, "The first letter of the day sets the tone. Best not to let the tone be frantic." And so it went. He would open the envelope with his feather-shaped letter opener, read it slowly, and place it in a special tray labeled "handled," though there was rarely anything to handle. Sometimes it was a letter about a missing button. Sometimes a thank you for the safe arrival of a parcel containing wool socks. Once, It was just a blank sheet with the words, "Hello, Edwin," written right in the middle. Whatever it said, it was always gentle, always uneventful, always deeply, soothingly ordinary. The rest of the day could be unpredictable. The door might rattle in the wind. The roof might leak. A letter from the city might arrive with too many forms. But the first letter of the day was calm. And that calmness filled the room like steam from a kettle, slow, warm, and entirely unremarkable in the loveliest way. Part 6: Why the dust on the shelves was left undisturbed for years. Along the back wall of the post office stood a set of wooden shelves. They weren't especially tall, or wide, or polished. In fact, they bowed ever so slightly in the middle, as though sighing from years of politely holding things that never asked to be moved. Each cubbyhole had a small paper label. Outgoing, north, not yet claimed, probably decorative, and the ever-curious, misc, inkle, or umbrellas. But what truly defined the shelves was not what sat upon them. Though the contents rarely changed, it was what lay on top of them. Dust. A soft, fine layer of it, not thick or dirty, but light, like the skin of sleep on a warm afternoon. And it was never cleaned. The postmaster dusted everything else: his desk, the doorknob, the teapot handle, even the brass label on the keyhook by the window. But not the shelves. The dust remained, season after season, gently settling, gently staying. Why? Some said it was for good luck. Others believed that Mr. Fleece was simply too short to reach. A boy once suggested that the dust had become part of the official postal record. If disturbed, the balance of the mail would be undone. But when asked, Mr. Fleece had a different answer. Some things are just better when they're left alone. The dust reminds me that not everything needs to be busy. And he meant it. The dust was not neglected, it was respected. It was the kind of dust that felt settled in more ways than one. It knew its place, knew its purpose. It softened the edge of the morning light. It absorbed the creaks and sighs of the old wood. It belonged to the stillness. And in a world that too often tries to polish and rush and rearrange, the dust on the shelves was a quiet, steadfast refusal, a gentle reminder that sometimes being left untouched is the most peaceful thing of all. Part 7: Why the post office cat slept on unimportant letters. Her name was Mildred. She wasn't officially employed by the post office. No badge, no salary. But everyone in the village understood that she was, in her own quiet way, very much in charge. Mildred was a cat of great softness, slow blinks, and a deep personal commitment to napping. She was mostly gray, with a white patch shaped vaguely like a teacup on her side. And she moved through the post office as though it had been built entirely for her convenience. She had many beds, though none of them were actual beds. Sometimes it was a windowsill. Sometimes a stack of string-bound newspapers. But most often, it was a pile of unimportant letters. Why? Well, no one told her to. She simply chose them, always the ones without urgency. Postcards with slightly smudged writing. Envelopes missing return addresses. Notices for community meetings that had already passed. Mildred would need them once or twice, turn in a full circle, and then settle her entire being atop the correspondence, purring faintly, as if blessing the paper with forgetfulness. There were rumors that she could sense the stress levels of ink. that she gravitated toward the least ambitious handwriting, that she found serenity in envelopes that had no real destination. The postmaster never shooed her. He'd simply glance over, nod once, and say, "Ah, yes, that one can wait." And it could, because once Mildred had chosen a pile, no one dared to move it. It was an unspoken rule, a sacred arrangement. Letters beneath the cat were on pause. Time paused with them, and in the stillness of her slumber, the room felt gentler, less insistent. Visitors would sometimes peek in and ask, "Is the cat allowed on the mail?" To which Mr. Fleece would reply, without looking up, "Only the least urgent mail. She's very selective." And she was. In the rhythm of post office life, Mildred's naps marked the emotional weather of the day. A soft-tailed twitch? Likely a wedding invitation. A deep, belly-stretched sigh? Definitely a bill that would go unpaid until spring. She never clawed, never chewed, never dragged anything away. She simply rested, quietly declaring, "This does not need to be dealt with today." And no one, certainly not the postmaster, ever disagreed. Part 8: Why rainy days made everyone whisper. It rained often in the village, not with thunder, not with storms, but with a soft, even drizzle that seemed to fall more out of habit than necessity. The kind of rain that didn't send people running for cover. It just made them walk a little slower, speak a little softer, and, within the post office, it made everyone whisper. There was no sign that asked for quiet, no official rule posted near the door. And yet, whenever the weather turned damp and the air turned heavy with the smell of wet stone and wool coats, voices instinctively dropped to a hush. Why? Well, perhaps it was the way the raindrops tapped gently against the windows, like fingers on old glass. Perhaps it was the way the wooden floor absorbed the sound of boots so thoroughly that footsteps became more suggestion than fact. Or maybe it was simply because on rainy days, everything in the post office seemed to slow down. The clock ticked more patiently. The kettle took longer to boil. Even Mildred, the cat, blinked more slowly between naps. Customers would step inside, shaking off droplets from their shoulders, and offer greetings in the softest tones. "Morning, Mr. Fleece. Just a parcel to post. Nothing urgent. No rush, of course." The postmaster responded in kind. His voice, already modest in volume, dipped into something closer to a murmur, like wind through long grass. Even the letters seemed quieter, edges curled slightly from the damp, ink darkening with subtle stains. No one complained. Rain gave the mail a kind of texture, a sense of having traveled. Some believed the post office itself preferred the silence, that its old beams and sagging shelves appreciated the peace that came with mist and murmur. And Mr. Fleece, when asked about it once, by a visitor from out of town, only offered this: "On rainy days, the world is thinking. Best not to interrupt." There was no need for thunder or lightning to mark the day. Just the soft tick of the clock, the patter of water outside, and the quiet understanding that not everything needed to be said aloud. Especially on a day when even the mail seemed to sigh. Part 9: Why the same envelope returned every Tuesday. It began on a Tuesday. A pale blue envelope, slightly rumpled at the corners, arrived without fanfare. The address was written in tidy, round letters. Mr. Thistleby, the house with green shutters. Top of the hill. There was no sender listed. No stamp either, only a careful charcoal sketch of a daffodil in the upper right corner where postage should have been. The postmaster, Mr. Fleece, gave it a thoughtful glance and placed it in the "to be investigated eventually" box, just below the scale with the rock on it. But the next Tuesday, the same envelope returned. No changes, no forwarding marks, no notes scribbled by impatient couriers. Just the same soft blue paper, the same precise handwriting, and still, no stamp. And so, a ritual was born. Every Tuesday, without fail, the envelope arrived, usually tucked innocently between a furniture catalog and a notice about chimney sweeping regulations. And every Tuesday, Mr. Fleece placed it back into its spot. Not in the outgoing tray, not in the misaddressed pile, but on the far left corner of the desk, exactly 1 inch from the ink blotter. Why did it come back? There were many guesses. Perhaps there was no house with green shutters at the top of the hill. Perhaps there once was. Or perhaps the envelope had simply decided it liked the post office better. Children began to ask if the envelope was magic. One old man suggested it was love mail, forever circling until read by the right person. A visiting cousin proposed it was a test from the Postal Inspector General, designed to gauge consistency and composure. But Mr. Fleece, when asked about it, would only smile and say, "Some letters just prefer to stay." And stay it did. Week after week, the edges grew softer, the fold line deepened. Sometimes Mildred the cat would nap beside it, her paw resting protectively atop its corner. It became part of the furniture, like the teapot or the squeaky mailbag strap. No one ever opened it. That would have felt wrong. Somehow, the mystery was not in what it said, but in its staying. In its decision to return. Again, and again, and again, and in a post office where not much changed. The dependable reappearance of a blue envelope every Tuesday was, in its own way, something to count on. Part 10: Why Mildred brought biscuits but never ate any. Every Thursday afternoon, just after the tea had steeped and just before the sunlight made its slow exit through the dusty front window, Mildred the cat would trot in from wherever she'd spent her morning, perhaps the windowsill. Perhaps a neighbor's windowsill, with a single biscuit delicately held in her mouth. Not a mouse, not a ribbon, not a leaf from the garden. A biscuit. Sometimes it was a round one with a faint lemon scent. Sometimes a crumbly oat biscuit. Once, memorably, it was pink and heart-shaped with a single sprinkle clinging to the corner. She would place it near the postmaster's feet or occasionally atop a stack of unimportant mail. Then settle into her usual nap posture as if nothing unusual had occurred. The biscuits were always untouched. She never tried to eat them, not even a nibble. They weren't stolen, either. They appeared too clean, too whole, too intentionally chosen. And though no one ever quite saw her take one, there were rumors that Mrs. Penwhistle, who ran the bakery 3 doors down, left a few outside her back door, just in case Mildred was in the mood to shop. Why did she bring them? Some believed she was offering thanks for the warm naps and the quiet company. Others claimed she was simply making her contribution to tea time. A boy with a particular fondness for stories insisted Mildred was paying rent. 1 biscuit at a time. But when asked, Mr. Fleece would simply glance at the little treat, give a soft nod, and say, "She has her reasons." And that was enough. No one dared eat the biscuits. They were left where they were. Until the end of the day when Mr. Fleece gently moved them to the tin labeled, "Not for posting." The tin itself sat on a shelf behind the desk. And by the end of each month, it held quite a charming assortment: biscuits with scalloped edges, biscuits shaped like bells, even one that looked suspiciously like a fish. It wasn't practical. It wasn't expected. But then again, very little in the post office was. There was comfort in the ritual, in the quiet, uneaten offerings, in the idea that even a cat might feel the need to give something, simply for the sake of giving. And somehow, the presence of those little biscuits made the room feel just a touch more complete. Part 11: Why the postmaster counted stamps in even numbers only. In a small drawer beneath the ledger, carefully labeled "Stamps," assorted, sat rows of tiny paper squares, neatly stacked, gently faded, and quietly waiting for purpose. There were stamps with steam trains, stamps with queenly profiles, one with a lighthouse that everyone agreed was too faint to be useful but too lovely to discard. And every single one of them had been counted. By the postmaster. In even numbers. Always. 2 at a time. 4. 6. Never 3. Never 7. Never, under any circumstances, 11. When asked for a stamp, Mr. Fleece would reach calmly into the drawer, fingertips hovering as if listening. Then select exactly 2, or 4, or 8, depending on the mood of the transaction. Even if the customer only needed 1, they were often handed 2, with a quiet, reassuring nod and the words, "You'll find a use for it eventually." No one ever argued. Why only even numbers? Some said it was about balance. That odd numbers left things slightly unfinished, unsettled. Others believed it was because his tea set, also meticulously counted, only had even numbers of cups and saucers. And perhaps the habit had simply spread. A passing clerk once suggested that counting by 2s was simply quicker. But Mr. Fleece responded, gently, "Not quicker. Just more comfortable." There was no policy about it. No instruction manual entry. But in that little post office, with its fogged windows and biscuit-bearing cat, the even-numbered stamps became a kind of quiet law. Children would mimic the practice at home, stacking coins in 2s, lining up socks in pairs. Elderly customers began to request 4 stamps instead of 1, to keep the balance, you know. And the stamps themselves seemed to cooperate. They stacked better in evens. They felt less alone. Somehow. 2 stamps together felt like a plan. 3 felt like an afterthought. In a place where so little changed, the way stamps were counted mattered more than one might expect. Even numbers, even temper, even pace. And with each calm, paired offering of postage, the world outside, noisy, uneven, unpredictable, felt just a little bit softer. Part 12: Why the wall clock was always 5 minutes behind. On the far wall of the post office, just above the coat hook no one used and just beside the framed, slightly crooked map of regional rail lines, hung a clock. It was round, wooden, and ticked with a sound that felt older than the building itself. The hands were a soft brass, dulled with age, and the numbers had faded to a gentle whisper of black. Yet despite its age, and its habit of slowing slightly in winter, the clock still worked. It simply ran 5 minutes behind. Always 5, not 6. Not 4. Exactly 5. It had been noticed, of course. Visitors would glance at their watches. Mr. Fleece would glance at the clock. Then, both would continue the conversation as if time itself had nodded politely and agreed to disagree. The question, of course, was why? Why not wind it forward? Why not fix it? One man, a traveling horologist, no less, once offered to adjust it, free of charge, tools in hand, a small magnifying lens perched dramatically in his eye. Mr. Fleece had thanked him kindly, then quietly declined. 5 minutes behind is still on time, he said. Some believed it was a kindness to the morning, that the day didn't truly begin until the clock said so, that it gave everyone a few extra moments to breathe before the hours officially started ticking. Schoolchildren loved it. They'd peek in the window on their way past and reassure one another. We've got 5 more minutes. The post office clock says so. Even Mildred the cat seemed to respect it. She never moved from her nap spot until the clock struck a soft, delayed noon. And over time, the village came to rely on the delay. It wasn't an inconvenience, it was a buffer, a cushion, a grace period. Appointments started just a little later. Conversations lasted just a little longer. And letters, though delivered with care, arrived at a pace that matched the clock. Not rushed, not late, just 5 minutes gently behind a world that often moved too fast. Part 13. Why no one ever sat on the green chair in the corner. In the farthest corner of the post office, tucked between a slanted bookshelf and a dusty umbrella stand, stood a chair. It was upholstered in green fabric, somewhere between moss and mint, slightly faded and worn smooth along the arms. The wood beneath creaked if you leaned too far back, and one of the legs had been carefully shimmed with a folded envelope. Long since yellowed, it was, by all accounts, a perfectly acceptable chair, but no one ever sat in it. Not the postmaster, not the visitors, not even Mildred the cat. It wasn't roped off. It wasn't broken. It wasn't marked in any way. But over the years, it had become unsat. Children knew not to touch it. Elders respected it. And newcomers, sensing the soft reverence in the room, simply chose other places to perch, perhaps the bench near the parcel counter, or the windowsill if they didn't mind a slight breeze. Why? There were stories, of course. One claimed it was once used by a legendary stamp inspector who took naps between audits. Another whispered that the chair had belonged to Mr. Fleece's grandfather and that sitting in it would be like interrupting a memory. But when asked directly, the postmaster would say only, "It's the thinking chair. It thinks better when left alone." And that, strangely, made sense. For even though no one sat in it, the green chair always seemed aware. It caught the light just right in the afternoon. Its seat bore the soft, eternal impression of someone who might return at any moment. And when the room fell quiet, as it often did, you could almost believe the chair was listening. Sometimes Mr. Fleece would glance at it during tea. Not long, not with longing, just a glance, as though silently acknowledging that yes, the chair was still doing its part. There was peace in its presence. Like a bookmark in a chapter you never quite finish. A conversation paused, but never ended. And so the green chair remained, empty. But never forgotten. Part 14. Why the suggestion box was filled with blank slips. Near the front of the post office, Beneath a hand-painted sign that read, "We welcome your thoughts, if you must," sat a wooden suggestion box. It was made of oak, with a tiny brass slot on top and a lock that had rusted shut decades ago, though no one ever tried to force it open. Beside it sat a stubby pencil on a frayed string and a small stack of suggestion slips, all cut precisely from the same cream-colored paper, each with the faint watermark of a teacup in the bottom right corner. They were never in short supply. Every week, Mr. Fleece would quietly restock the slips, trimming new ones by hand from leftover parcel wrappers. Always with care, always in silence, and every so often, on slow afternoons or after particularly long waits behind a customer deciding between small parcel and letter post, someone would take a slip, scribble, and slide it in. Yet, when the box was opened each spring, a tradition marked by the placement of daffodils on the windowsill, its contents were always the same: blank slips. Not one suggestion, not one complaint, not even a doodle of a postman in a funny hat. Just paper, clean, folded, untouched by ink. Why? Some said people changed their minds before writing. Others believed the act of holding the pencil was enough, that by picking it up, the desire to suggest simply faded. A quiet child once theorized that the box erased complaints, that it absorbed frustration and gave it back as stillness. But Mr. Fleece, when asked about the blank slips, gave a small smile and said, "Most people already know what they want to say. They just like being offered the chance." And maybe that was true. Maybe the value wasn't in the writing, but in the possibility. The simple comfort of knowing you could speak your mind, even if you chose, in the end, to let it rest unspoken. And so, the box remained, refilled, reopened, re-respected, a small, wooden silence beneath a sign that encouraged sound. And year after year, slip after slip, the suggestion box continued to collect not complaints, not ideas, but something gentler. Permission to say nothing at all. Part 15: Why there was a small rock on the weighing scale. Near the edge of the postmaster's counter, just beside the tin labeled, "Not for posting," sat the official postal scale. It was a fine little instrument, brass arms, tiny counterweights, and a circular weighing tray worn smooth by decades of letters, buttons, and the occasional improperly sealed jar of elderberry jam. But what made this scale peculiar, if one were inclined to notice peculiarities, was the small rock resting permanently on its tray. Not balancing it, not weighing anything, just sitting there. The rock itself was unremarkable, about the size of a walnut. Gray with one faint white stripe down the middle. Smooth, but not polished. It looked like something one might pick up absent-mindedly on a walk and forget to put down. And yet, it never moved. It was never weighed, never questioned, never acknowledged in official transactions. It simply existed, quietly, consistently, on the weighing scale. Why? Visitors would pause, glance at it, open their mouths, then decide against asking. Children asked most often, of course. Is that to keep the scale steady? Is it magical? Does it count as a very small parcel? Mr. Fleece, when asked, always answered with the same line. That's the calibration stone. Keeps everything in balance. It wasn't clear whether he meant balance in weight, or in life. Over time, the rock took on a sort of symbolic status. When weighing parcels, Mr. Fleece would lift it with great care, just for a moment, place the item on the tray, conduct the weighing, record the results, and then replace the stone exactly as it was, with the stripe facing south. Some believed the rock had always been there, even before the post office had walls. That it had once been part of the very path that led to the village. That removing it would somehow undo the quiet rhythm of things. Others found comfort in its presence. The scale didn't feel ready without the rock. It felt exposed, incomplete. The rock made it whole again. And so, the small stone remained, unlabeled, unmeasured, undisturbed, its purpose not entirely practical, yet entirely understood, in a place where nothing rushed and everything had its place. Even a rock, especially a rock, could mean something. Part 16. Why tea was brewed twice each afternoon. Just in case. At precisely 2:14 p.m. every day, not 2 o'clock. And never as late as 2:30. The postmaster would rise from his creaky chair, straighten his vest with 2 small tugs, and head toward the back room. There, on a low shelf between the ledger archive and the emergency biscuits, shortbread only, stood the teapot. It was ceramic, pale blue with a tiny chip on the spout. And it had never once been replaced, not because there weren't better teapots in the world, but because none had ever asked to. And every afternoon, tea was brewed. Twice. Always twice. The first pot was made quietly, gently, with great patience. Mr. Fleece would rinse the leaves, warm the pot, and pour just enough to fill 2 cups and a little extra. He would take 1 cup to the front desk, set the other by the suggestion box for anyone who wished to sit and sip. But he always made a second pot. Not immediately. There was a pause, a space. He would wait until the minute hand moved 2 full notches past the half hour. And then he would repeat the whole process again. No one ever asked for a second cup. No one came in demanding tea. And yet, the second pot was always brewed. Why? There were theories, of course. Some thought it was habit, inherited from a predecessor long since retired. Others said it was a signal, to the building itself, or perhaps to time, that the day was ready to settle into its final chapters. But Mr. Fleece, when asked, offered only this. The first pot is for the day that's already happened. The second is for whatever might still arrive. And sometimes, something did arrive. A late parcel. A forgotten letter. A neighbor who needed a place to sit and say nothing for a little while. And when they did, the tea was warm and waiting. Even if no one came. The ritual mattered. The second pot filled the room with a fresh aroma, chased away the sleepy scent of ink and wool, and gave the afternoon a kind of quiet punctuation. Mildred, ever observant, would often rise from her nap during the second brewing, stretch once, and then resume her slumber in a slightly different spot, as if acknowledging that the shift from early to late day had occurred. 2 pots, one for certainty, one for possibility, and in a post office where very little had to happen, it was comforting to know that something always would. Part 17. Why the window was opened 1 inch every morning. Every morning, just after unlocking the door at 7:03 a.m. and before placing the kettle on for its slow, silent boil, Mr. Fleece walked to the front window and opened it. But not all the way. Not halfway. Not even enough to let in a full breeze. Exactly 1 inch. Measured not with a ruler, but with the practiced eye of someone who had done the same thing every day for longer than most could remember. The window itself was a bit stiff, with a tiny crack in the top corner and 2 scratch marks near the latch, one from time, the other from a wayward umbrella incident of 1897, still remembered by some with a nostalgic shake of the head. And that 1 inch? It never changed. Summer or winter, rain or sun, whether the birds were singing or the roof was leaking. The window opened 1 inch, and remained so until precisely 11:47 a.m., when it was quietly closed again. Why? A few theories fluttered around over the years. Some said it was to let the mail breathe. Others claimed it was to allow good fortune to drift in with the morning mist. One child confidently announced that it was for the post office ghost to come and go, without opening the door like a normal person. But when Mr. Fleece was once asked, gently, over a second cup of tea, he replied, 1 inch is enough for fresh air. But not so much the world comes barging in. It was true. The small gap allowed in a little bird song. A bit of chimney smoke from next door. And, now and then, the faintest whiff of Mrs. Penwhistle's morning scones. It also kept the room balanced. Not too closed, not too open, like a held breath in the middle of a long and peaceful thought. The villagers came to respect the inch. Children peeked at it on their way to school. Neighbors would glance through it while posting a letter, nodding politely at the breeze. And Mildred, the cat, would often sit just beneath it, whiskers twitching slightly, as if reading whatever the air had to say. Some days, nothing at all happened because of that window. Other days, everything did, quietly, gently, and just enough. Part 18: Why the parcel from Leeds was never claimed. Near the bottom of the shelf marked, "Not yet claimed." Behind a stack of envelopes labeled, possibly for Mr. Griggs, sat a parcel. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with blue string, and bore a faded return address. Leeds, 1893. The handwriting was tidy, the postage correct, and the corners only slightly bruised by time. It was neither large nor heavy, about the size of a biscuit tin, if one were guessing politely. And it had never been claimed. Not once. Not even almost. Mr. Fleece had logged it in the ledger on a quiet Monday, noting, "1 parcel, Leeds, unto a Mr. Emmett." No further detail. Awaiting collection. And then he had placed it gently on the shelf, where it had remained ever since. Year after year, season after season, still waiting, still present, still very much unbothered by the passing of time. Why? Some believed Mr. Emmett had forgotten. Others thought he'd moved away before it arrived. One theory proposed that Emmett was not a person, but a code name for a secret tea blend too dangerous to be delivered directly. But when asked about it, usually by visitors who spotted it and couldn't help themselves, Mr. Fleece would simply say, "Not every parcel wants to be delivered." And that, in the quiet world of the post office, made perfect sense. The parcel from Leeds became something of a fixture. Mildred once attempted to nap beside it but found the string disagreeably tight. The suggestion box collected 2 blank slips that year. Both slipped in shortly after someone noticed the parcel's age. Over time, it faded slightly in color, absorbed the scent of ink and dust, and grew into something more than just an undelivered item. It became part of the place. People who didn't believe in patience came to believe in that box. People who didn't believe in waiting started to understand it. And still, it waited, never restless, never asking to be opened, just existing quietly in the corner of a room designed for movement, yet full of stillness. If, one day, Mr. Emmett were to walk through the door, hat in hand, eyes uncertain, the parcel would be there, unchanged, and if he never did, it would still be there, perfectly content to remain a small, brown monument to all the things in life that don't need to be finished to be meaningful. Part 19. Why the final letter was always placed in the same pigeonhole. At the end of each day, when the tea had cooled and the afternoon light had turned the windows amber, Mr. Fleece would perform a small, quiet ritual. He would reach for the final letter. Not necessarily the last to arrive. Not the longest or the most colorful. But the one he had quietly set aside all day, perhaps out of instinct. Or courtesy. Or something softer still. He would read the address. He would run his thumb along the edge of the envelope. And then, gently, he would place it in the third pigeonhole from the bottom, far right column, beneath the label. Pending, thoughtfully. No other letters went in that slot. Only one, each day. The final letter. Always in the same place. Why? Some said it was symbolic, that the last letter deserved a place of rest. Others believed the pigeonhole was special, blessed by the quiet patience of years of thoughtful deliveries. One boy confidently declared that the letter in that pigeonhole decided the tone of the next day's weather. But the postmaster, when once asked by a curious visitor with a clipboard and a list of efficiency questions, simply replied, "It's not about where it goes. It's about letting it know it matters." And with that, he had returned to his tea. The letters themselves were never particularly remarkable. A receipt for spools. A birthday card with no return address. A note that said simply, "I'm still knitting." Yet placing the letter in that specific pigeonhole gave the day a kind of punctuation. Not an exclamation mark. Not a question, but perhaps a soft period. A pause. A breath before the dark. Mildred, who normally ignored such bureaucratic gestures, would sometimes stir when the letter was placed, offering a single blink of approval before resuming her nap. Over time, villagers came to refer to the slot as the one that mattered. No one else used it. Even during busier months, even when space was tight, because there was a quiet understanding. The final letter, however ordinary, deserved its moment, a tiny ceremony of placement, a closing of the day's thoughts. And in that small gesture, consistent, unnoticed by most, the post office reminded everyone that even endings, when done gently, could feel like kindness. Part 20. Why closing time felt more like a soft goodbye than a routine. At precisely 5:01 p.m., never 5 o'clock, and certainly never early, Mr. Fleece would stand from his chair with a quiet exhale. Not a sigh of fatigue. Not a groan of relief. Just the kind of breath one takes when finishing a page in a favorite book. The post office would already be still. The final letter tucked into its pigeonhole. The kettle, long cooled. The inkwell, capped. And Mildred, curled into a comma near the ledger, dreaming of, presumably, undelivered biscuits and sun-warmed window ledges. Mr. Fleece would walk slowly, checking the hooks, still holding keys that hadn't been used in years. Running his hand once along the shelf labeled, "Eventually," and tapping the corner of the desk, as if reminding it gently, "You've done well today." Then he would turn the sign in the door from "open" to "closed." Not with a clang or a snap, but with the softest motion, barely more than a whisper. Why did it feel so gentle? Some believed it was the silence that followed. Others said it was because nothing in the post office had ever felt rushed. So the ending never felt abrupt. It was, as one neighbor once said, more like tucking the day in with a blanket than locking up a building. Mr. Fleece himself never announced the end of day. He didn't need to. The walls seemed to know. The floorboards creaked in farewell. The clock gave its final 5 minutes behind chime like a yawn. And those who walked past in the fading light, headed home with baskets or folded umbrellas, would glance in and see the same image. A man in a tidy vest, gently closing a door, not shutting it, not slamming it, just closing it, and somehow, it felt less like something was ending, and more like something was being cared for until morning. That's what made closing time different here. Not the time itself, but the way it was honored. As if the day, with all its uneventful charm, its blank slips, its untouched biscuits, its barely busy ledgers, deserved a proper farewell. Nothing rushed, nothing loud, just a soft goodbye,